Marvel Snap's newest card, Caliban, Horseman of Pestilence, is a 3/11 with a shockingly easy condition, so why isn't he hitting? Caliban might be the easiest of any objective card that's released this season, and considering the state of some of the other objective cards, that is no mean feat. All Caliban is asking you to do is to have 3 cards that cost 4 or more. That's an incredibly easy thing for most Marvel Snap decks to accomplish. Think back to when you first started playing this game. You were playing probably a deck that played a 3, and then it played a 4, and then a 5, and then a 6, and that was the game plan, and that is what Caliban is asking you to do. What's interesting, I think, about what Caliban represents is actually quite similar to Drax' Avatar of Life, which is to say that this is a card that is good. It is a good card. In previous iterations of Marvel Snap metagames, this would be an absolute beast, right? A 3/11. But there are 2 things that hold it back. The first is, unlike Drax, this is afflicting -7 power when you complete the quest, and that afflict is not necessarily targeted where you want it to be. It'll pick among the highest cost cards on your opponent's side of the board. So if your opponent has multiple 6s, well, it could hit the wrong one. This fallibility is a little bit more than its 3/4 scalar compatriot. Drax is really gonna be able to match. What that means is that Drax outperforms Caliban on average. The second thing is that Afflict is much easier to build against than something like an end of turn like Drax that gains power. You can take away the power Drax has accrued, but he will still go and gain power at the end of turn. Whereas this card is simply shut off by a Luke Cage, or if it fires early enough, even a Shadow King. That is the big problem that this card has, is that in the role that it exists in, there is already a 3/4 that we can reasonably count on to scale upwards when we're playing a deck full of bigger things. That card is Drax Avatar of Life, and that is the biggest problem that you'll run into when you're playing Caliban decks, is you need to have a coherent reason why you are doing it. 3/11 is not bad stats. There are decks that are going to be happy to have the stats that Caliban has access to, but they are few and far between. That said, I've got a large group of them for you to take a look at so you can get a sense of how this card is impacting the high-level metagame. Ika is a particularly influential deck builder. I think a lot of people don't necessarily put the respect on his name that they should, but he's a guy who will often find compelling angles on new cards a lot faster than everyone else will. And this is a revival of the old school version of Blackbolt Stature that is also using a Goon Knight Proxima tool in order to deal with a lot of what combo decks are doing in the metagame. What's interesting about this specifically is that a Blackbolt is particularly relevant against Mr. Negative Star-Lord, and Moon Knight discarding those cards can also be particularly powerful. So there's some really interesting stuff that you can do with a list like this if your opponent isn't necessarily prepared for the ways in which you're going to disrupt them. But it is kind of getting a lot out of the specific having a bunch of things that do some stuff and your opponent's not really knowing what those things are necessarily. This deck has a lot going for it, right? There's the basic version of Mercury Cannonball with a Fenris Wolf, which is still a powerful thing to do in mid-range matchups. Stripping your opponent's resources gives you a plan into combo decks. You have Gambit Hail Marys. You have Killmonger, who is just an excellent card against a lot of decks right now. And what is Caliban doing here? Well, mostly what Caliban is doing here is just trying to get some stats out of the 3-cost spot. Decks like this previously didn't have a lot of options for a bunch of stats. These are decks that rely on stripping your opponent's cards out of their deck, preventing them from doing the things they want to do. Oh, your hand is shredded. Oh, you're bored. Your card that you were really counting on got Mercury Cannonballed. Sorry. That's how they win. So this is a deck that actually is in need of what Caliban is selling. It's saying, I need something that is going to be just a big amount of stats for 3 that I don't have to put a ton of effort into and is not going to screw me over the way something like Gladiator is. And that is where Caliban is actually shining. But is this a list that I expect to be playing in a couple of weeks? I think the honest answer is probably not. It's very of the moment in the sense that you really aren't going to beat a lot of negative people with this if they know you're doing it, right? Like, if they know you're going to Blackbolt on 5, they just play the card on 5. Like, that's the big thing that this deck runs into, is that it's really surprising the exact first time you play against it and get your Iron Man Blackbolted because it's a 0/5 sitting in your hand. And then it stops being surprising, and you're like, oh yeah, that's probably what's going on here. Now that I've seen, Fenris Wolf Moon Knight, I've got a pretty good idea that I got to play around a Blackbolt on 5. And that's kind of the issue that I would see this deck having going into the future. Probably the easiest slot in for Caliban is in Doom 2099. I mean, I think that was kind of on everyone's bingo card as the free space. That's a deck that makes a bunch of 4s and plays 1 card a turn, so pretty clearly it is interested in playing a 3/11. Now, there is something to point out here, which is, first of all, it is probably replacing Jack Flag. I would have called it definitely before actually playing with it, but not working with Aurora is actually kind of a thing that does suck a little bit. It is still going to be probably a bit of a more reliable 3/11 than Jack Flag, but once again, we are feeling the pain of Aurora working with basically every mechanic except objective. Now, that is not something they plan on fixing. If I'm not mistaken, I saw a team answers from Glenn that said, no, that's not really a bug. We wrote the card to be what it is. We don't need to constantly add mechanics to Aurora, which is bad news for me because I am constantly asking them to add objective to Aurora, and that's basically just them saying no, they won't do it, which is respectable. But also, I do think that it does hurt the validity and the viability of a lot of these objective cards. The biggest reason for that is that objective cards tend to be into a design space. At least this first group of objective cards, they're in a pretty safe space. They're asking not too much out of you, and they're giving you good stats. And that's fine. And it's a reasonable thing to do. These are like very vanilla-y cards, which is what you would want to do when you're demoing a new mechanic. Objective, I think, has gone over better than basically any other mechanic they've done because they made these cards easy. I think it's actually kind of a massive success that nobody is out here actually confused about anything about Objective except the time when it works. That's really good. This is like really, really, really good. They didn't make any like real duds like some of the 4-cost activators before Jocasta came out, right? They didn't fall into any of the pitfalls that they fell into with Activate. They really made a mechanic that instantly hits, is evocative, and did a lot of work. The reason that was able to happen, though, is because they made a lot of the first wave of objective designs, to me, a little bit boring. And they made a bunch of these cards that, like, there's not a lot going on there. The card says something, and then you do what the card says. And that limits the kind of decks it can go in, right? It's saying we're going in decks that are all about stats, and only about stats, and that's it. Because you're not doing anything special with this. Where, like, with Star-Lord, for example, there are combos with Star-Lord. You're taking Star-Lord and you're multiplying his power. With Show Lao, you're multiplying his power. When you're taking these cards and you're just playing them exactly as written, a lot of the time what you'll end up with is a pretty good card that they thought would be a pretty good card, and not anything that's actually going to, like, break the game in half. And the biggest thing that this is true for is you really notice it in decks like this. But the real problem is the only deck that really wants to play Stats Moron is a deck that has a bunch of proactive tech cards in it. That deck overwhelmingly in recent months has been defined by Aurora. That archetype has been defined by Aurora. So I know that it's not necessarily good design. But I do think that these cards, the objective cards, are suffering because of the way they were designed, meaning that they would be good cards to go in Aurora decks if they simply worked with her. Because the only decks that are particularly interested in those are Aurora decks. And you see that even here, where it's like, okay, we don't have the proactive tech, but what we do have is we just really want as many stats as we can get all along the curve, and then we're going to Aurora them on the final turn of the game, and it's like that -2 points actually does hurt. Like, it sucks. And so it's just one of those things where the way they designed these cards makes me feel like they would be much better fits in Aurora decks than they otherwise are, right? If she worked with them. And that's really what I'm getting at. I'm not saying they actually have to change it. I'm saying that they made a bunch of cards that are pretty easy to trigger, and so they mostly do what they say on them, and that type of card is an Aurora card. And I bring this up in this context to say that, yeah, it's probably better than Jack Flag, but it really is a little bit closer than I thought it would be, largely because Aurora doesn't work with it. Afflict is in a very weird spot where it really doesn't actually want to be a Luke Cage deck on its own unless you're playing Anti-Venom. And then if you are playing Anti-Venom, it's like, well, why am I doing the Wiccan thing? Very weird deck, but Afflict is a deck that actually really does want specifically 3s right here. And so this is actually like a really actively good 3 in decks like this. So there is some upside here, but it's like, okay, largely that happens after the Wiccan, right? So the real reason this deck wants 3s is because when you Wiccan, you need to do 7 on 5, which is a 4 and a 3 almost overwhelmingly. You love that. When you don't Wiccan, a lot of the time what you need to do is 3+3 on 6 so you can get a hazmat down. This guy is a good 3 to do that with. The problem then becomes you will not trigger him. That's what really gets you here. Because if you're not Wiccaning, right, you play a 4 on 4, you play a 5 on 5, and then you play a 3 and a 3, unless that 4 on 4 was an active Wiccan or an anti-Venom that hit another 4, you are not going to actually get the trigger on the Caliban. That said, he's really close to being good here. Like, if Afflict has problems, they're not related to Caliban. They're much more related to the concept of being an Afflict deck, which is always sort of at its best when it can be a mid-range deck that goes above the other mid-range decks because you need very specific tools to interact with it, mostly Luke Cage, and it is able to have a lot of really efficient large men in exchange for not really actually running a ton of interaction. So when Afflict is at its best, it gets to like have its interaction be part of its proactive game plan. Like if you're playing a bunch of Doom 2099, you have like a US agent. If you're playing a bunch of small decks, you have like a man thing. Those are kind of tech cards, right? And so that's when Afflict is at its best, is when it's able to leverage those in metagames where games are being won by small amounts of points by simply having really big and efficient guys against other decks full of efficient guys. We aren't in an efficient guys metagame, and so any problems that this deck has are so much less related to Caliban and so much more related to being Afflict that it almost feels unfair for me to blame it on him. Another version of the Afflict list, this one much more dynamic, but a little less, let's say, objectively powerful. It's hard for me to talk about the differences between this because there's a lot more dynamism and final turn explosive points in this, but a lot less raw numbers than are in the other versions of the Afflict list, and I think that's an interesting contrast. Largely, this is a deck that has been around for a long time. The basic premise is you get a cheap Abomination, you get a cheap Miles Morales, you play a bunch of stuff on the final turn of the game, it's a big amount of cards, and you're really leaning on the overlap between Rocket and Groot as an Afflict card and Rocket and Groot as a move card to trigger both Abomination and Miles Morales. This deck has been around for a while. Roram and Cougar have named it BYU because they are both from Utah, and that is a very, like, it's a fine deck. It's just like, this deck's problem was basically never that something that Caliban could solve. This deck's problem is that it's only points, and that of the decks that are only points, it is one of the weaker ones. And the reason for that is largely because other decks that are only points are able to facilitate multiplicative things in ways this deck is not. Decks that are only points include things like Invisible Woman First Steps. If they set that up, you don't beat them. Like, you can do some cool stuff to make Iska kind of small, but you don't beat them. And so there's a lot of things that go on in a deck like this that make things very awkward because unlike a lot of other only points decks, you are not multiplying the effectiveness of your cards by themselves. You are just playing stats. And this is sort of the big thing that you get at when you play enough Caliban is he's just what he says. And we're in a world of Marvel Snap where everyone wants to multiply. And if you're not multiplying, you're losing to the people that are. And so this is a deck that is very good at beating like a Sholau. You can handle that. That's a normal amount of points. You can do point output and beat that. If you're playing against the Doom 2099, you can handle that. That's a normal amount of points, and frankly, you've got a US agent. You feel good about it. If you're playing against a ramp deck, you can handle that. You allocate your points efficiently, and you beat the fact that they play one card a turn. All of that is doable. You play against Mr. Negative, you have to retreat every time they snap. You play against the Star-Lord deck, you have to retreat every time they snap. You play against an Invisible Woman deck, you probably have to retreat every time they snap. And there's stuff, like there's things you can do, but your output fundamentally is capped in a way a significant portion of the metagame just is not. So on the whole, I think the biggest point of comparison for Caliban is Drax Avatar of Life. I feel like it's pretty rare for me to play a game of Caliban and come away feeling like I wouldn't have rather played Drax. The only time where I think I've actually been excited to play Caliban is in that Moon Knight Blackbolt shell that Ika cooked up. Other than that, I think a lot of the time, this is a very replaceable card. He's cool, he does good stats, but I really don't like having my stats being invested into something that is easily dealt with by opponents either going over the top of caring about 7 power or simply putting a loot cage in their deck. I didn't even see that many loot cages. I played a little bit. It didn't really feel like I needed a loot cage to beat this Afflict stuff. You could just beat him by playing the game. And that's sort of the biggest thing that Caliban runs into, is that if you're going to play a sort of linear scaling stat stick, I think he just kind of gets mogged by Drax Avatar of Life. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.